Marcion's Gospel is not like Q. Q is a purely hypothetical text. It is never mentioned by ancient authors, and it has no manuscript attestation. By contrast, Marcion's Gospel is attested over 700 times by over 15 witnesses. These witnesses, all of them hostile, sometimes quote the exact words of his text and point out key differences from the Gospel according to Luke. There are rules for reliably reconstructing Marcion's Gospel, and it's important for readers to understand these rules, since, with one possible exception, not a single manuscript of Marcion's Gospel survives. In this video, I'll be taking the position that it is not safe to use readings from the Catholic scriptures on their own to reconstruct the gaps in Marcion's text. Catholic versions of the New Testament, even the distinctive witness of Codex Bezae, are not witnesses to Marcion's text. At best, they can only serve to corroborate the primary witnesses to Marcion's Gospel. I'm Dr. David Litwa, and on this channel, we explore topics from the Greco-Roman world, early Christianity, and Gnostic studies. It's my joy to provide free content. To do this, I depend entirely on your support, so please consider supporting me on Patreon, making a one-time donation, or by taking one of my many courses, like Introducing Marcion, the Hermetica, and Redating the Gospels. Eventually, all my courses will be available to you on one single subscription called the Gnosis Academy, and being part of this academy involves a monthly hangout with me, so join and introduce yourself to me personally. Links are in the description. The primary witnesses to Marcion's Gospel are Tertullian from early 3rd century North Africa and Epiphanius from late 4th century Cyprus. They were not neutral scholars trying to reconstruct Marcion's text. They were avid apologists on the hunt for ways they could use Marcion's Bible against him. They collected passages which they thought either agreed with their own theology or opposed what they thought was Marcion's theology. Tertullian commented on Marcion's text systematically, but not exhaustively. Epiphanius, for his part, wrote out a set of passages from Marcion's Bible. Later, he attached explanatory notes to them in order to refute Marcion, re-quoting passages he had earlier collected. Epiphanius was writing in Greek, Tertullian in Latin. Probably Tertullian had a Greek copy of Marcion's Gospel, making his own translations as he went along. Tertullian was more thorough in picking out passages for comment, yet he also left sizable gaps, and due to writer's fatigue and the desire to avoid repetition, he became less and less thorough as he progressed. Many times he would simply skip over a passage with no comment. Either this was because the passage didn't differ from his own text, or he felt it didn't suit his argument against Marcion. In the end, then, there are many passages in the Marcion's text that must be marked unattested. These are passages which Tertullian, Epiphanius, and the others skipped over without informing us whether they were there in Marcion's text or not. They are not evidence that Marcion omitted these passages. It is often the case, moreover, that Tertullian paraphrased Marcion's text, deleted words, and changed word order and conjunctions to suit his own writing context and style. Tertullian had his own citation habit, that is, his own peculiar way of quoting biblical texts, clear from his other writings. Just as today, some English speakers revert to the language of the King James Version when quoting the Bible, Tertullian reverted to his own Latin text that was familiar to him and to the gospel that he most favored, namely, according to Matthew. Occasionally, Tertullian even rebuked Marcion for not citing passages in Matthew when Marcion obviously never set out to do so. All this data indicates that from Tertullian, although one cannot reconstruct the exact wording of a particular Greek text, one can often get a good sense for the gist of Marcion's text. Let me be clear, it is modern scholars who are retranslating Tertullian's Latin into Greek. In the 20th century, Ada von Harnack's edition of Marcion's Gospel reigned supreme. Now it has been replaced by other reconstructions, and more reconstructions continue to appear. The beginner rightly asks, why are there so many reconstructions of Marcion's scriptures? This is an important question because the diversity of scholarly reconstructions might give an excuse to those who would rather not engage with Marcion's text for theological or other reasons. Even among experts, the uncertainty of reconstruction might induce one to think that a reconstruction isn't possible. Recent reconstructions of Marcion's texts are different, to be sure, but largely because they work with different sources and methods. Readers can understand those sources and methods and so make a judgment as to which reconstruction is best for them. Tertullian and Epiphanius are our main sources, with Tertullian generally seen as more reliable since he had Marcion's text directly in front of him. Most scholars also allow readings from the Adamantius dialogue. This is an early 4th century dialogue written by an early Catholic Christian that initially features a debate with two Marcionite speakers, namely Matthias and Marcus. Scholars have cast doubt on the Adamantius because the Greek version is attested by only medieval manuscripts which have corrupt quotations. If the dialogue depends on an earlier anti-Marcionite source, as some have argued, then it probably had no direct access to Marcion's scriptures. The Adamantius is also frequently loose in its biblical citations and inconsistent, and it shows a bias for the Matthean rendering of verses. Thus, while some scholars allow the Adamantius as a witness to Marcion's gospel, they don't think it attests its exact wording. Others only use the Adamantius as a check on Tertullian and Epiphanius. When the Adamantius stands alone, it can offer at best a reading with slight probability. Reconstructions which try to fill in material from texts that are actually or not explicitly sources for Marcion's texts are methodologically questionable. These texts, like Codex Bezae and manuscripts of the later Gospels, never say that they're quoting Marcion's Gospel. They aren't explicit sources for his Gospel. One, of course, might use these texts rightly as supporting evidence, but they can never stand alone, and they should not trump the main witnesses, Tertullian and Epiphanius. It is the duty of the reader to check the footnotes of a scholar's reconstruction to see exactly how they made their decisions. In reconstructions prior to the mid-1990s, editorial decisions about what to print for Marcion's text were still often based on a presumed knowledge of what he would have added, changed, or deleted from canonical Luke due to his supposed theological editing. Regardless of one's position on the priority of Marcion's gospel, it is now widely agreed that one should not reconstruct a text based on presumed knowledge of Marcion's theological tendencies. Scholars are not mind readers, and heresiologists are often misleading. Accordingly, one must first reconstruct a text on the basis of empirical evidence, actual attestations in patristic sources. This methodological advance means that Harnack's and any earlier reconstruction is unreliable and should be avoided, even though these are the kinds of translations that are available free online. Furthermore, reconstructions that do not take systematic account of the citation habits of patristic authors, that is, how they normally cite a verse, are inferior to reconstructions that do. And this is because when patristic authors quote or paraphrase Marcion's text, they often let their own favored way to cite a verse shape how they cite Marcion. What they quote, in other words, is based on their memory, a memory that is sometimes contaminated by the biblical version they prefer. It's like a conservative Christian who, having been taught the KJV on his mother's knee, easily slides into the cadence and vocabulary of the KJV, even when claiming to cite another version of the Bible. So if Tertullian cites Marcion in a way that conforms exactly to his other citations in his other works, then he's quite possibly misrepresenting Marcion's text or misremembering it. Knowing an author's citation habit provides an important check, but it's not foolproof. Sometimes there are no examples of a heresiologist citing a particular verse elsewhere. Tertullian and Epiphanius wrote a lot, and so we can check there are multiple citations of a verse. In other cases, that's not possible. Accordingly, although paying attention to citation habit is important, we can't always follow through. Compounding the problem is that our sources, for instance Tertullian, know the text of Matthew's Gospel the best, and so this makes it hard to determine whether the Matthean readings in Marcion's text actually are original or are later imported. At the very least, each Matthean reading has to be weighed with care before it's printed in Reconstructions of Marcion's Gospel. Matters become more complex when the heresiologists conflict with each other. When heresiologists disagree on a reading of Marcion's text, they do so about 63% of the time, almost two-thirds. Many of these disagreements aren't really semantically earth-shaking. They differ regarding the word order of a sentence or the use of a conjunction, the tense of a verb, and so on. But occasionally their wording is significantly different, and the editorial decision about what to print becomes momentous. This is when attention to method becomes doubly important. Sometimes citation habit can solve the problem. Tertullian might have gotten a verse of the gospel wrong because he cited it in his own peculiar way. Sometimes multiple attestation can help, for instance, when Tertullian and Adamantius agree against Epiphanius, or when Epiphanius and Adamantius agree against Tertullian. Occasionally, a second century reading agreeing with Marcion's text is preserved in a variant of Canonical Luke, especially in so-called Western witnesses. If scholars print an unattested text because they judge that the logic of the passage demands it, or because they assume that the heresiologist simply skipped over it, that unattested text can stand, but it can never stand alone as evidence. One should not make an argument, that is, about what Marcion thought based on an unattested text. One should base one's conclusions only on what is actually cited, not on what we think is logical or probable. This means that there will inevitably be gaps in reconstructions of Marcion's text. In order to fill those gaps, scholars have used two other indirect sources, that is, texts and variants from Canonical Luke and texts and variants in other Gospels, according to Mark, Matthew, or any other. How one uses these two other sources determines whether one is a minimalist or a maximalist editor. For a minimalist editor, we can use the example of Dieter Roth. Roth mainly uses the direct witnesses of Tertullian and Epiphanius. He subordinates any evidence taken from the Adamantius, and especially from the Catholic manuscripts of Luke, only using them to support or confirm the direct witnesses. A more maximalist editor is Matthias Klinghardt. Klinghardt does prioritize quotations from the Church Fathers, but he is also happy to print readings which he derives mainly from the variants of Canonical Luke. Occasionally, he even allows these latter variants to trump the direct witnesses. He explains his logic as follows. When the attestation for the Marcionite Gospel from the Church Fathers and from manuscript variants disagrees, then as a general rule, the version most removed from the wording of the majority text of Luke represents the Marcionite Gospel. Practically, what this means is that Klinghardt is sometimes willing to fill in material from Canonical Luke manuscripts, and I find this problematic. To my knowledge, Mark Bilby is the only editor who allows indirect evidence not only from manuscripts of Canonical Luke, but also from manuscripts of other Gospels. This is because, in his theory, the Gospels are like audio transcripts, and recordings from previous Gospels can be heard in later ones. Effectively, words or sounds from Marcion's Gospel were rolled into the initial and later versions of Matthew and John, as well as into Canonical Luke, and even into later versions of Mark. Bilby uses stylometric and statistical methods to isolate what he thinks are the unique words or sounds of Marcion's Gospel that continue to exist in the DNA of the later Gospels. Now, I'm not in a position to judge Bilby's stylometric analysis, but I will note some potential problems with this overall method. In order to get data for Marcion's Gospel, he uses information from pre-critical reconstructions of the Gospel, namely from Hahn, Zahn, and Harnack, who worked well over a century ago. This results, in my view, in corrupt data because these editors generated their texts of Marcion's Gospel based on their view that Marcion was an editor who cut out material based on his ideology. A second problem is that, at least in the current version of Bilby's reconstruction, he does not offer specific explanations for how he chose to include individual words and phrases. This is very different from both the text of BeDuhn and Klinghardt, both of whom offer a verse-by-verse set of notes accompanying their translations and justifying their decisions on what to print as Marcion's text. A third problem relates to what we might call aesthetics. Bilby insists that his reconstruction is scientific, but his motivations for reconstruction depend on an analogy from aesthetics. He depicts himself as restoring a work of art. The essence of his maximalist approach, he says, is to restore as much of the detail and color underneath as possible, so as to bring back the artwork as close to its original state as possible. This means that for Bilby, there is no unattested in Marcion's Gospel. There is only present and not present. This procedure is problematic in my view because there are, in fact, gaps left in Marcion's Gospel, and I think we should acknowledge these gaps frankly and humbly. Scientifically, it isn't our solemn duty to fill in all these gaps. Moreover, to fill in the gaps from Catholic manuscripts of Luke or from other Gospels involves us in a greater chance of making a mistake, because these are not direct witnesses to Marcion's Gospel, and choosing words or phrases that go back to Marcion's text is based in part on educated guesswork and theories about how Marcion's Gospel arose. In my view, the goal of scholarly reconstruction is not to fill in all possible gaps in Marcion's scriptures, but to produce a reconstruction out of actually attested material. Aesthetically, of course, we would all, myself included, like to read a text of Marcion's scriptures without any gaps. And it's natural to prefer a continuous narrative with complete sentences and paragraph divisions. But that's simply not possible here, given the nature of our sources. Accordingly, in my judgment, reliability will trump aesthetics in this case, and the only reliable text for Marcion's Gospel is one attested in a patristic source. Accordingly, the safest and best reconstructions are those that prioritize quotations from church fathers as direct and reliable evidence. The rule here is simple. Readings of Marcion's Gospel with the highest certainty come from people claiming to quote Marcion's text. Variants in Luke might go back to a Marcionite reading, but it's nearly impossible to say for sure. Why is this the case? It's the case because, in my view at least, Marcion didn't compose the oldest version of the Gospel, such that all Gospels derived from his wording. And although I agree that stylometric analysis can greatly help us to discern the authentic voice of the Marcionite text, the reality is that the earliest textual history of the Gospels is too obscure and complex to trace direct and exact phraseology in the Catholic manuscripts, many of which are medieval. The best scholarly procedure is to use Jason BeDuhn's two-step model, which is in fact very similar to Roth's method. Step 1, screen the patristic sources for quotation habits, theological agendas, and rhetorical strategies. And in doing this, we minimize the inclusion of anything not directly attested in our sources. Step 2, resolve apparent contradictions by comparing known variants in the Catholic manuscripts. Readings in the Catholic manuscripts can indeed help us choose what to print from the patristic sources, but we start with the patristic sources, and we acknowledge that readings in the Catholic manuscripts never trump the patristic sources, and they should not be used independently of these sources. So what, in the end, is my practical recommendation for someone wanting to use a reconstruction of Marcion's text, but not sure which one to use? Well, as in any serious study of the canonical text, you have to use multiple versions. Think of the reconstructions on a scale from minimalist to maximalist. I recommend that you begin your study with the minimalist reconstructions that prioritized actual quotes of Marcion's text. Here we can use Roth and BeDuhn. Then one can proceed to check the reconstructions that print readings partially based on Catholic manuscripts of Luke and other Gospels, namely Klinghardt and Bilby. The conservative reconstructions, such as the one published by Roth, will often serve as a check against the more liberal reconstructions. English speakers are well served by Jason BeDuhn's translation of both Marcion's Gospel and Apostolos in 2013. BeDuhn has now published a corresponding Greek text of Marcion's scriptures with the collaboration of Bilby. Personally, this is my first go-to source, but it remains untranslated. And this brings me to a final point. To do serious study of Marcion's text, you need to learn Greek. Any translation of Marcion's scriptures is beguiling because it suggests that there's an exact and stable text underneath it. In the Greek, however, the exact sequence of verbs, their tenses, and the choice of conjunction are often unclear, and scholars simply have to guess. The basic rule to keep in mind is there will always be some degree of fluidity and uncertainty in any reconstruction of Marcion's text. Patristic authors paraphrased, condensed, translated, and reworded their sources, making the exact wording of the text obscure. For those wanting to learn Greek, I have a full introductory course plus a textbook that you can use. Occasionally, I also have live courses in which we go through a Greek text with me as your guide. I hope all of you will take advantage of this. As a final note, I'll just emphasize that all of this is my own particular take on the landscape of scholarship in early 2025. Other scholars will obviously disagree with me, but I hope that this video has at least empowered you to make your own decisions about what reconstruction to use. I hope you'll all join me in my online course introducing Marcion and consider purchasing my new book on Marcion called Marcion, Gospel of a Holy Good God.